So hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I've come out again today because I did this video back in West Bay last week or so now with two folding cameras, and they were untested, and I wanted to kind of basically put them through their paces, show you, demonstrate how they work, and then take some film and see which one I prefer the look of. And even though they did both produce some good results, I didn't really kind of come away with any conclusions as to which camera I preferred. So I thought I'd come back out today to have another go. Last time around they were loaded with some Ilford HP5 Plus. This time I've put in some Ilford FP4 Plus film. If you're familiar with Natural Trust properties, you might notice that actually Kingston Lacy is behind me at the moment. And as well as Kingston Lacy, there's a kind of Natural Trust mill down here called White Mill, and another location that I want to have a look at today, just again to scope out for future videos, is kind of like an abandoned church close by. So hopefully today with the film cameras I can shoot some interesting subjects, as well as probably like the cliched shots here at Kingston Lacy, to see which camera I prefer using and ultimately what camera produces the best results. So I loaded the film last night and I just came here and I just tried to do a shot of the actual building behind me itself, because it was quite quiet when I got here just a minute ago, and the Balda worked fine, but I think the Seagull camera might have broke, and yeah, I just can't see at the moment how that's going to work for me today. Right, so this is the Seagull camera in question, and the reason why I think it's not working as well as it probably should, or it's not working at all really, is when you open the camera like so, you obviously dial in the settings on the front of the camera, and then you have to cock the shutter before you can actually fire. It won't let you fire it until you actually press this lever here or pull it back to cock the shutter. And when I pulled it this morning, there's just no resistance there. Normally you can hear the gears kind of cocking in effect, but it just feels like it's too loose. And anyway, when I try to operate the shutter, I still cannot press the shutter button on the top. So I think this camera is basically unusable at the moment because of that little problem. So I might have to have a look on YouTube and see whether there's some repair guides out there that I can open this up and try and fix that little problem. Because like I said in the last video as well I did, the self timer switch doesn't work either. It's completely jammed, but this lever to me, the cocking lever, just feels like it's either broke or it's just not connecting to the link that it needs to connect to. So when I'm trying to fix that as well, I might as well also at the same time try and open up the lens, because I did notice when I was looking at the camera last night, I do feel that there's perhaps some fungus in between the two lenses, or in between the two pieces of glass which make up the lens. So I'll have to see. Obviously I can't use this camera in its current state, so I might as well see if I can fix that, and if I can, then see what I can do about the actual lens itself. But it's a real shame because this camera, as I mentioned in the previous video, is a rangefinder camera, and this particular model is a coupled rangefinder. So that means when you're dialing in the focus at the front, that also shows you the image across your viewfinder, so you can line up your shots. I also brought as well, again with me, the Gossen light meter that I used last night. Again, I dialed it into ISO 125 because that's what the FP4 film is, and yeah, it seems to be working okay. Because if you've been watching my channel, I did have a bit of a blip when I tried to use it in Corfe Castle, but it does appear to be giving me some reasonable readings today, and it worked fine in West Bay, so I've got no reason to think that it's not working the Gossen light meter here. So that leaves me today really shooting this West Germany Balda Mess Baldax camera, and I mentioned it in the last video as well, but there are a couple features on here that aren't working. So if I just open it up with the switch there, so unlike the Seagull, I can cock the shutter at the moment, the self timer works, the aperture and the speed selection dial all works. The only potential issue is that speeds slower than about 2 seconds I found don't work. They're a little bit kind of sticky, so they might need a bit of oil or something, I'm not sure. But if I just stay away from those, it's been working fine. And on the top of the camera as well, the double exposure protection, the DEP, doesn't work for some reason. This camera also has a frame counter, which doesn't work. But beyond that, the rangefinder seems to work. So when you look through the camera, you can see the frame. But it's a shame, the Seagull viewfinder is lovely to use compared to this one. This one is really quite small, but at least this camera seems to be working at the moment. And unfortunately as well, this one only takes 6x6 images, whereas the Seagull, which ironically cost me the most money, cost me more than double that this Balda cost me, has the option to shoot 16 6x4.5 inch exposures when it's working. And even though this one's got a rangefinder, it's uncoupled. So when you dial in the distance on the top here, you then have to translate what it tells you onto the actual front of the lens here as well. Right, so the plan for this video is, obviously I've just given you a quick run through of the cameras and the issues I've had with the Seagull, and to why you're only really going to be seeing images from the Balda for this particular video. But I was just going to literally just put up some montage now of the locations that I go to and the shots that I take, and hopefully this time I can find a better variety of subjects, more close to the camera, to see whether I can get a bokeh effect going with this folding camera, as well as those shots which are focused to affinity. Yeah, so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to draw more definitive conclusions regarding these two cameras, other than the fact that the Balda works and the Seagull doesn't. But yeah, and hopefully you can see as well behind me, when I was at West Bay using these cameras for the first time, the sky was very kind of bland and flat, whereas at least this time there is some interest in the sky, as well as hopefully some variety in the subjects that I find as well. Like I said, I'll run that montage of the images and the B-roll of the locations that I'm shooting in, and then I'll talk through the results at the end, and I might kind of draw some conclusions with the image quality in my other medium format film camera, the Yashica 24, that I've been very pleased with. It's just, like I said in the previous video, it's a little bit heavier and more difficult to use, whereas the folding camera just takes up no room whatsoever. So it's very versatile, but if the image quality isn't as good as the Yashica, or I don't get as creative results from this camera, then I'll just have to persevere with the Yashica. So anyway, let's get to it, and I hope you enjoy the images and the locations that I find today, and I'll speak to you back in the office to go through some of those results with you. So, see you in a bit. Well, what do you know, the Seagull just sprung back to life. The cocking lever just felt very loose, and then I noticed on the top of the camera the double exposure protection indicator was showing red. So what I did is I just slightly moved on the lever, so the film kind of moved on a little bit more, and that cleared the double exposure prevention indicator, and then that allowed me to cock the shutter and fire off probably an underexposed image. So I redid the metering, did another shot here of this scene, and fingers crossed it's now back in the race. So let's get back on to the rest of the video. Right, so I wasn't planning on doing another talking head because obviously the images you've just seen are the fruits of my labour today, and I have managed to get all those shots in just one day. So since I started talking to you this morning, which was probably about 10 o'clock, it's now pushing about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So I was keen to kind of get out today and shoot both of these films in one go, and I've achieved that, thankfully, ending back at kind of one of my favourite churches in Dorset at Holnest. And yes, it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of Dorset today, actually, because obviously I started down in Kingston Lacey, and then you saw in the images as well where I've been since then. But you could probably also tell now it's extremely bright, and I'll be interested to see how much of an effect that has on the images, because obviously when I was in Kingston Lacey this morning there was a lot more cloud around as well, so there wasn't as much light, whereas now I'm having to kind of shelter under some trees because it's just so bright at the moment. And a few of those last exposures I was pretty much just shooting straight into the sun, but just trying to kind of shield the lens as much as I could. But I'm pleased to say that both cameras seem to operate correctly after my initial struggles with the Seagull earlier this morning. So yes, I'll be really interested to see how well those results turn out, and obviously you've seen them before me. So anyway, I'll see you back in the office. Right, we'll try this again. I just literally filmed the whole segment here and then realised that I didn't have the Rode Wireless Go plugged in. So yeah. So anyway, I generally found that the Balda produced the most consistent set of images from that trip. Even though I did have some success with the Seagull, I do feel like on the whole the Balda did a better job. And as you saw in the video, early on I had some real trouble with getting the Seagull to actually work. And then as the day progressed and the scenes were becoming lighter and brighter, I just really felt that the Seagull struggled. There was a couple instances obviously where the Seagull managed to produce an image where the Balda didn't, for a number of reasons. Mainly, I was saying this, I'll say it again because I said it all before anyway, but with the Seagull, obviously when you're composing for a shot, what you actually, when you dial in this, what you see is what you're going to get. Whereas obviously with the Balda, because it's uncoupled, you've got to dial it in here with the rangefinder and then dial it in here as well. So maybe a couple of times I didn't line those two values up, or whether the rangefinder itself needs a little bit of calibration. I don't know, but generally on the whole though, I do feel that the Balda did a better job. Another positive for the Balda was that even though the images came out quite bright, the negatives were quite bright, and I'll show you a couple examples in a minute, I did find that I could recover a lot more information and produce an image more akin to what I was looking for, whereas on the Balda I really struggled to get the image looking decent. Right, so we'll just have a look on the computer and I'll just talk through some of the results, and this will be the first time that I've actually looked through the results side by side just to see which one of the cameras is actually the best. Even though from looking at the images in isolation, I do feel that the Balda is the better camera. So let's just have a quick look. So obviously with the start of the day with this one, I managed to capture this great shot with the Balda, and I just, for whatever reason, the Seagull just wasn't working at this time. So if I zoom in here, you can see that it has captured quite a lot of good detail, and I didn't actually realise that this smoke was in it until I actually developed the film. If I just press this button here, it will show you what the negative scanned like. So that was the original negative, so I was obviously very worried that I wouldn't be able to recover any of that detail in the sky, but as you can see from the actual final edit, I was able to recover quite a lot of information. And this was another image that was quite bright as well with the boulder, and you'll be able to see when I press the compare button, that's what it looked like on the negatives. So yeah, so I was really pleased that I was able to retrieve a lot of the information from that negative. Right, so this is a similar image to what you'll see in a minute with a comparison with the boulder, but this is the final Seagull edit for this particular composition, and this is what the actual negative looked like when I scanned it. And you would have thought, looking at that there would be more information that you could pull from it to achieve a final image, but I really struggled whether the Seagull just didn't capture enough dynamic range in the scene to allow me to then push it hard in post for whatever reason. I don't really know why it didn't let me take it as far as what I could do with the bolder images. The exception to rule, obviously, and I'll come to this comparison in a minute, is this great shot I took of Kingston Lacey through these kind of trees. And if I go back to the original image rather than the JPEG, so again, it came very bright, but I was able to actually, in this case, there must have been enough dynamic range in the image captured that I could actually achieve a decent final image. But if we go back to the train one that I took with the Seagull, so this is the Seagull one. So if I look at what the original negative showed me, it wasn't actually that bad. And again, I thought I'd be able to get it up to where the boulder was in terms of its final edit, but I just really struggled. And I'll go back to the comparison now, and you'll kind of see how they both compare. Yeah, and I'll start with this image with the Seagull, because obviously you saw it at the beginning of the video. I had real trouble getting the Seagull to actually work, and it wasn't until I noticed that the double exposure prevention indicator was showing red that kind of gave me the idea just to nudge the film on a little bit further, and then that allowed me to capture something. Even though this looks to me like a multiple exposure, I'm not convinced that it is, because obviously I couldn't take the shot until I'd advanced the negative, and this was one of the first shots of the day. So yeah, I really have no idea what happened with this image on the Seagull, but I actually really like the image, because apart from perhaps this part of whatever that is, the rest of it I really kind of quite like. It's got that real kind of vintage film feel to it. But anyway, let's get on to the comparisons. So when I did actually, that I think was then my first image, and then that allowed me then to carry on the day as I intended. So what you're looking at now is the left image is from the boulder and the right image is from the Seagull. And as I talked about earlier, I found that I could get a lot more information from the boulder negative, even though it was bright, than I could with the Seagull. There's just a lot more punch, I guess, to the boulder image, whereas yeah, the Seagull one, it didn't really do that well in this particular composition. So if I move on now to one which is difficult to compare with this one, because I focused on different depths, if that makes sense. So I messed up here. So when I used the boulder on the left hand side, I think I recall that I shot a distance in terms of focusing at about 7 feet. So that's why straight in front of here there's an area of kind of in the focus kind of wildflowers in this meadow here, whereas the actual hut in the midground is completely blurred. And I didn't want it completely sharp like I've done here with the Seagull. I wanted it a little bit mysterious, but not that much mysterious in the boulder. Whereas obviously with the Seagull composition, I think I'd probably set the focus distance to about, I think it must have been about 2 to 3 meters, hence why more of the hut is in focus. But you can see it again here, just the actual quality I feel of the image on the left is it's just got something about it compared to that image on the right, which is still good because it does pick up a lot more detail on the actual shepherd's hut, I guess, in the midground. But I just feel, yeah, I just really like the Balda image here as well. It probably would be a lot better if there was just a little bit more of that detail in the hut. But it was a good, fun experiment to do this, and I was looking for different shots rather than just always going for those landscape or architectural building at infinity focus type shots. And again, I really struggled on this day finding those close-up subjects because I had some trouble with the rangefinders in that I didn't really believe with what they were telling me in terms of how far the subject was away to how I saw it in reality. So generally the shots that I took on the day are still of a more infinity nature. And again here, I'm sure that I set both cameras to infinity. So obviously this worked with the Seagull, but for some reason the Balda didn't quite work. So whether, like I talked about earlier, whether I need to calibrate the viewfinder a little bit more just to see whether when I'm dialing in infinity, whether it is actually corresponding to an infinity distance. So then moving on to this image as well. Again, this is one of the ones where the Seagull did work and came out pretty sharp looking, actually, the details, whereas the Balda just completely failed here. And whether it's probably not the Balda, it's probably me in that I got the distance in wrong on the rangefinder. But again, like, it could be an issue like before where what I tuned the distance in on the rangefinder might not have corresponded to the actual distances in real life. So that's something I'm definitely gonna look at. But then it did work in other images, so I'm not entirely sure that that was what happened here. Then I went to this abandoned church, which I couldn't get access to because it was all boarded up. So, and it was a little bit too tight really for an image. So this is as best that I could get really. So I think I've managed to match the composition pretty well. The light conditions were pretty much identical while I was taking these shots. And as you can see, again, I feel that the Seagull is perhaps sharper here, but I end up preferring the Balda kind of rendering of the scene. And that's probably a common thing really. Sometimes the Seagull, the lens does appear to be sharper in some instances, but overall I prefer the look that I achieve with the Balda. Then I went on to this White Mill scene, and I can definitely see the differences more here. There just seems to be more like contrast and dynamic range in the Balda shot compared to the Seagull, which is quite flat in comparison. And I did try to boost the contrast to match the Balda in the Seagull image, but there just doesn't seem to be the information there to work with, whereas there was plenty of information that I could recover from the Balda negatives. But again, as you can see on this image here, I do feel that the Seagull is, well, actually it's difficult in this one. The Balda does look pretty sharp, and whereas like these parts of the building are a bit more detailed. But no, both cameras have done quite well. But there's definitely a more 3D looking image I feel that the Balda has produced here from, again, the same scene. I was sat in the same place, and it's done a really good job. So then we move on to the Shillingston train station, and to be honest, this was probably my worst decision to go here in the day. The sun was completely dominating the scene, hence I showed you earlier. The scene came across so bright, and again, it's just I really had to work the Seagull image here to recover detail, certainly on the left hand side and in the sky, whereas I didn't really have to push the Balda a great deal, and there's so much more detail and contrast in the scene on the left hand side. And just the tonality I just find so much better in some of these images with the actual Balda camera. So yeah, definitely another win with the Balda here. So this is what I talked about earlier with the Seagull. This area of damage here on the right, I've got no real idea how that was caused, because if it was a problem with the bellows, I would have expected to see that kind of damage all the way through the images, but it was only really in a few of them. I really like this scene here with the way that the tree was casting its shadow on the side of the mill, and this is where I had a bit of an issue with the Balda, in that I took that image, the same image as the Seagull image, moved around to the front, and then in that time I forgot to wind on the Balda, and that led to this multiple exposure here, because you can see the railing there and a bit of the tree pattern coming through. So yeah, it was a bit of a shame, but yeah, the Seagull image, I have no idea why that light damage occurred. Again, I was sat in the same place, same light, and this time I managed to get a really good exposure with the Balda, capturing a really nice spring scene down at the mill. Whereas again with the Seagull, I have no idea why that occurred on the right hand side, and you can see I haven't even bothered removing some of the developing kind of bits of fluff from the image, because it's nothing really worth saving, whereas the Balda again has done a pretty good job. Probably not as sharp as I'd like it, and as I said before, I might try calibrating the rangefinder just to see whether I can improve the camera's ability. So then I moved on to Holnest and Holnest Church, and again, as I said earlier, you can see the Seagull is increasingly struggling with this light, and it was extremely bright here, and you can see a bit of flare, I guess, on the actual Balda, but I was kind of putting my hand over the lens to try and shield it a little bit from the sun, and I'm surprised actually how well the Balda, how good the image from the Balda turned out, whereas obviously you can see with the Seagull, again, I really had to work this image hard to get what you're actually seeing here, which is not great compared to the Balda. But what I do love about the Seagull is and as I said earlier, it definitely comes across as a lot sharper, the lens, compared to the Balda. So yeah, I'll talk about what I'm going to be doing with these cameras after the next image, which is the final image. And I got to this point and I thought, right, I really need to do another close-up image, because I wanted to basically shoot the camera wide open, so f4.5 on the Balda and f3.5 on the Seagull. The problem with that is at the time of day I was trying to shoot at, and with the camera only having a shutter speed of 1/300th of a second, I really had to underexpose the image to get a shutter aperture combination that would allow me to capture the scene. And what I ended up doing was setting the gossameter to ISO 50, so that was about roughly one stop underexposed the image. And as you can see on the left, the Balda absolutely nailed this shot. It's exactly what I was looking for. I'd have liked to see a little bit more definition of the light bulb in the actual lantern itself, but as you can see, compared with the Seagull image, it's a lot better. And yeah, so the Seagull just seems to really struggle at bright light, and yeah, I just don't really know what was going on with the Seagull. But it obviously can produce some good images, because it did manage to produce like that shot of Kingston Lacey earlier in the day through the hedgerow here. And again, that light here wasn't as bright as it was later, so maybe that had a bearing. Right, so I'll just do a quick wash up now between these two cameras and just tell you what are my next plans with them, really. So we'll start with the Balda. Obviously, as I just talked about, even though the images do show up in focus when the distance is correct, it's probably not, compared to the Seagull, not as sharp in some places. And it's funny as well, actually, because even though, look, you see here the viewfinder on this camera compared to the viewfinder on the Seagull, it's so hard to compose your shot. And I often find I have to take my glasses off so I can get my eye closer to the image to actually compose my shot. But funny enough, I actually find that the shots come out better composed with the Balda than they do on the actual Seagull. So that's a bit of an odd quirk. Another advantage of the Balda as well is that it's definitely a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter than the Balda. I expect the fact that this has a coupled rangefinder is the reason why this one is a little bit heavier. So what don't I like about the Balda? And it's the flip side earlier, whereas even though I found that this camera was easier to compose with, or the images came out better composed, that there's no getting away from the fact that that viewfinder is absolutely minuscule. It's also, because this door comes out here, it's really hard to actually grip on to the camera. So I often find that it's actually probably easier to hold it down here and just use that side for kind of support. But yeah, there's nothing really to hold on to when you're actually using the camera and trying to grip it from this side. Yeah, so I'll definitely be using the Balda again. I don't think I'm going to try and fix the double exposure prevention or the frame counter, because it generally is quite easy to see on the back when you're using the winding on mechanism to see when the next exposure is, and that's your frame counter then on the back of the roll of film. So the frame counter for me is a little bit superfluous. The double exposure prevention would have been nice, but it is quite nice sometimes to have the option of doing a multiple exposure, or even doing an accidental multiple exposure, because I find that they produce the more magical images if you don't know that you're actually shooting a multiple exposure. Yeah, so I don't think I'm going to bother trying to work out how to take this off safely, because obviously, like I said, I'm really generally quite happy with the results. I just find that they're almost not as sharp as the Seagull that I've tried, so I doubt they're going to be as sharp as the actual Yashica twin lens reflex camera that I've got as well. So the only thing I think I'm going to try and do is to fix the rangefinder, because that might then help me focus onto subjects a little bit better in terms of accurately estimating their distance in order to then tell the lens that that's the distance that I want to focus on. And I think to do that, you just take the screw off here, and then you get access to like a horizontal adjustment screw that you can then look through the rangefinder to an infinity subject, focus on infinity, and then if the two images don't align, then adjust it so that they do align. And that, I think, would calibrate this particular camera. Yeah, so definitely one that I'll be using again. Right, so let's move on to the Seagull, and it's definitely a lot heavier and a little bit bigger compared to the actual Balda. I might put up on the screen here how much these two cameras do weigh, because if you want a compact 120 film format camera, then this one definitely seems to fit the bill better than this one. Although this one, as we'll come on to, does have some advantages that is making me want to persevere with it. So looking at the positives first, like I said, that you might be able to hear it being picked up on the actual thing. I was worried about it initially. Like, I'll do it, see if you can pick it up. Yeah, so that noise that you can kind of hear sometimes is actually the masks in the back of the camera. So if I open up the back of the lid, in here, it's going to be hard. In here, see, you might be able to see that on the screen. There's this little flap here, and they are what flap over here. And then when you lay your 120 film on, that's how you shoot 6 by 4.5 inch exposures. And obviously there's one on this side as well, which needs flipping over. And then I'm pretty sure as well, when you look through the viewfinder on this one, there are a couple bars either side of the image. And I think that's what allows you to line up for the smaller 16 6 by 4 5 inch exposures, which you can obviously then see the number on the back of the film for the corresponding exposure as well. So that's definitely an advantage. So as I said, the double exposure prevention on the Balda doesn't work, but it does generally work on the Seagull, apart from obviously that first image I showed you where it looks like a multiple exposure, but I'm not entirely convinced because it does almost work too well, in that sometimes I'm ready to take an image, I've cocked it, I line it up, and it won't let me fire it, and I find that I have to just literally move the lever on a little bit, just enough for it to clear, and then I can take the image. So it almost works a little bit too well, and that's probably what led to the problems earlier on today. So another positive over the Balda obviously is this has the coupled rangefinder, which I won't talk about anymore because I've laboured that point itself, but it's definitely a reason probably why this is heavier. Right, so let's quickly just move on to the things I don't like about the Seagull, other than the things I've already laboured on. I definitely found the Seagull a lot harder to see the back of the numbers, and you won't be able to see it on the film, but it definitely looks like it could do with a bit more of a clean, because I can definitely see some residue around the window that makes seeing the number on the back of the camera quite hard. And it didn't happen so much with this roll, but in the last roll, even though the negatives were not overlapping, sometimes they were very close to each other. So that's probably because of that, and probably by the fact that I've got to wind on a little bit more to get rid of the DEP indicator on the top. And yeah, I talked about it obviously before, but I just feel that this camera lacks the dynamic range and the contrast of the Balda, and even though the images in some instances were sharper than the Balda, in other instances they weren't. So I'm not really sure what's going on with the camera. Whether it's to do with a lens coating thing, whether the coating is still intact on the Balda, but it's not present, or it's not as good on the Seagull, I'm not quite sure. So what's next for the Seagull? So obviously I'm definitely going to use the Balda again. I think I'm probably going to use, like I said, I'm going to try and calibrate the rangefinder, and then I might pit it against my Yashica twin lens reflex camera just to see whether they compare. Yeah, but with the Seagull, I really want to try shooting 16 exposures on a roll of 120. I've never done that before, so that'll be a first for me. So I'm just interested to see whether I like that more economical use of film, whether it works better for landscape, or whether ultimately I prefer the 6x6 format from these cameras. Yeah, I'd really love to clean the lens, but I think you're going to need some fairly specialist tools to do that, and I'm not sure whether I have the skills to attempt it. I have heard conflicting reports that you could put some lighter fluid into these cameras to try and help free up the shutter speeds, because as I said earlier, there's a self timer here, but it's just completely jammed up. But I'm kind of reluctant to do that, because I've heard lots of reports as well that you get a temporary fix, but then it causes more problems down the line because it moves the grot onto somewhere else. So yeah, so I'm not convinced yet I'm going to try that. I think I'll see what happens when I use it again, and then make a decision on whether I'm going to keep it or whether I'm going to move it on. But anyway, this has probably ended up as being quite a long video again, but I generally found this video really interesting to shoot, and I just generally quite like using these old film cameras, and yeah, and I definitely just want to keep using them really. So yeah, so I hope you enjoyed that video and the results that I was able to achieve from these two cameras. And as always, thanks for watching. Bye for now.